Brilliant. So the focus of this talk is the archive of the Norwich Consistory Court, which was in effect the Bishop of Norwich's court. So it was the highest court within the county. And more specifically, those records refer to generally as penances. They relate to the punishment of people described by the church as, and I'm quoting here, as whoremongers, adulterers, fornicators, and all such unclean persons, of which there's quite a lot in Norfolk. This talk is the culmination of a mini project, part funded by our charitable partner, the Norfolk Archives and Heritage Development Fund, commonly known as NORA, to conserve and catalogue a box of penance documents. So before I start, thank you, Nora, because I think the chairman is probably online. Thank you. Until now, these penances, like the whole court archive, have been difficult to use and, as a result, underused. They are fragile, liable to fall apart, and as a result, there's a very real risk of the loss of information. So the Record Office, we've got an ongoing programme to open up the archive one box, one volume at a time. The whole archive, including the penances, is likely to be of great interest to family, local and social historians, and to those studying the history of women particularly. They also give an interesting insight to the lives of ordinary people, so they're just of general interest. My hope, therefore, is to encourage use of these documents and to encourage support of our work to unlock other records of the Norwich Consistory Court. I will put these records in context, but please note that unlike a namesake, there is a Dr. Jonathan Draper, who is a theologian and clergyman. I'm not him. So that's for the purpose of the YouTube video. Every now and again, I get emails from him and he must get emails from me. The document on the screen is part of a penance schedule. We'll look at this type of document later in the talk. So the archive of the Norwich Consistory Court, which we've got at the Record Office, dates from the late 15th century. I think the earliest document is 1499, but it centres on the 17th and 18th century, particularly. That's where the bulk of the records are. There are well over 100 boxes, mainly with a reference of DN Con and DN DEP for deposition. The Consistory Court is the name of the Bishop's Court for ecclesiastical law for the Diocese of Norwich, and there's still a Consistory Court today. They deal entirely with internal church matters, largely relating to land and property in the diocese. But they used to have a much wider jurisdiction. The church courts were concerned with such matters as sex outside of marriage, defamation, and the conduct of clergy. The documents we'll be looking at today date from the 18th century, and this extract is in a book relating to penances, highlights the context of these records' creation. So we'll look at this volume in particular as the talk goes on, but it provides more context as to what was going on. So the highlighted text reads, received salutary and canonical penance was enjoined. The word I want to highlight is canonical, and I always struggle to say it, but this is a reference to the Book of Canons, which was approved by the Convocations of Canterbury in 1604. So this whole process is reinforcing, enacting the canons of 1604, and they replaced earlier canons. But that's what we're referring to within these documents. And so this is one of the canons, and I think this is probably the most relevant, and I'll read the text now. If any offend their brethren, either by adultery, whoredom, incest, or drunkenness, or by swearing, ribaldry, usury, and any other uncleanness and wickedness of life, the church wardens or questmen and sidemen in their next presentments, their ordinaries shall faithfully present all and every of the said offenders to the intent that they and every of them may be punished by the severity of the laws according to their deserts, and such notorious offenders shall not be admitted to the Holy Communion till they be reformed. So the Norwich Consistory Court created different types of records. The most salacious are probably the books of depositions. These are effectively statements of evidence taken by court officials outside of the court. Another type of record are broadly referred to as penances, the subject of this talk, and they relate to the punishment of people guilty of committing a crime in the eyes of the church. So we have 6 boxes which contain penance-related documents. They are difficult to consult, and there is a real risk of permanent loss of information, as I've said. Note the fragments which have come off the document just by lifting it from a box. There was no conservators around when I did this. But this is very typical, and it's from a box with the number DN-Con 86. This is a file of penances, of penance schedules, and was the main focus of the conservation work which Nora funded. A file, in this case, is a bundle of papers and or parchment attached together by a cord. They would have been put on this cord once they were no longer needed on a day-to-day basis. So once they've been dealt with, put on the cord and not really looked at again. And the cord is usually tied very tightly. And you can just see the cord there. And it so happens that all the unique information to each schedule is at the top where it's most tightly tied. So you can see the problems of actually using this document. So in order to know exactly what is in the documents, to make them discoverable, we needed to do some conservation work in order to reduce the risk of permanent loss of information. For this mini project, we decided to look at DN-Con 86, and this was the inherited catalogue entry. So you can see DN-Con 86, it just says penances 1729 to 1767. That's it. There was nothing else other than the bits underneath, file of certificates of penance and the book of penances. There's no names, no places, no crimes, nothing on the catalogue. So only those researchers who know what penances are happy to spend a lot of time going through the document in our conservation studio because of their fragile nature, are likely to get anything from them. So I hope you can understand why we wanted to do something with them. So despite there only being 1 file and 1 volume listed on the catalogue, there's in fact 2 files, the volume and lots of loose papers that were in the box or in the volume. So the first step was to catalogue the loose papers and put an entry in for both files. So what have we done so far? We've catalogued the loose papers, we've conserved both files. So you can see the files here for the purposes of the people in the room. So they're the top row next to the volume. I've lost my place. So we've conserved both files whereby papers have been removed from the cord, numbered so they remain in order, cleaned, flattened, and tears repaired, and crumbly edges reinforced with paper repairs. So all of these documents are paper, there's no parchment in these ones. We've digitized the volume and the conserved papers from the 2 files. And we've been running a volunteer project to first catalogue the volume, and now the volunteers are cataloguing the files. So I don't know if there's any volunteers here or online, but thank you for the work that they've done so far and the work they're they're doing at the moment. And we're slowly, so the catalogue for the book has been done, and I'm in the process of uploading that to our catalogue, and that will go public within the next month, and then the other documents after that. So let's look at the penances in a bit more detail. So this is a schedule of penance. The majority of documents in the files are schedules just like this. Often they are printed, so that gives you an indication of the volume coming through the court that they bothered to get printed forms done. And sometimes they are handwritten. But each schedule usually relates to a single cause or case. It basically says what someone has to do to be forgiven for committing a crime in the eyes of the church. A cause can be defined as a case before an ecclesiastical court. So if I say cause, I mean a case. So let's look at each bit of the schedule. So this is the top part. As I said before, it contains the unique information, I suppose. So a schedule of penance enjoined the 16th day of May, Anno Domini 17th something, it's obscured, by the Reverend Mr. Kirkby, clerk, surrogate to the Reverend and Worshipful Thomas Tanner, Doctor in Divinity, Chancellor of the Diocese of Norwich, to Samuel Collett of Wilby, so this is the key information, in the County of Suffolk and Diocese of Norwich, for the crime of adultery or fornication by him confessed to have been committed with Susan Rouse of Stradbroke, widow. Is it? So enjoin in this context means a formal imposition of a penalty, task, duty, or obligation. And the date, as I said before, is obscured. That hole was created by the cord. That's where the cord went. And you'll note that Samuel is not from Norfolk, he's from Suffolk. So at this time, the Diocese of Norwich covered Suffolk too. So this is the next part of the schedule. I'll read it out again. The said Samuel Collett shall be present in the parish church of Wilby on some Sunday before the 23rd day of June next ensuing, standing penitently in the middle alley before the minister's seat or pulpit, clothed in a white sheet, holding a white rod or wand in his hand, having a paper pinned upon his breast, describing his fault or sin, and then and there in such sort to continue during the whole time of divine service and sermon, and at the end of the same, before the congregation is dismissed and the blessing given, shall upon his knees make his humble confession, repeating every word after the minister with an audible voice as followeth. It's very Game of Thrones. I don't know if anyone will, but it did happen. And this is what Samuel had to read out. And I'm very conscious that the last time this was read out was 300 years ago in the church. I, Samuel Collett, do here in the presence of Almighty God and this congregation here present, humbly confess and acknowledge that I have most grievously offended his divine majesty in defiling my body by committing the heinous sin of fornication with Susan Rouse of Stradbroke, widow, for which my said foul offence I am heartily sorry, and do sincerely repent thereof, and beg of God mercy and forgiveness for the same, desiring all you here present to take warning at this my punishment for the avoiding any the like wickedness, and to pray to God for me and with me that his wrath and plagues threatened against whoremongers, adulterers, fornicators, and all such unclean persons may be turned away from me and this town where I live, and desiring also all good people to forgive me this scandal which I have given to them and the profession of Christianity. And I do promise by God's grace for the remainder of my days to live soberly, chastely and godly, which that I may do. I desire you all to join with me in prayer and say the Lord's Prayer, and Father, etc. I won't dwell on this. I don't mention it later in the talk, but we do have repeat offenders, mainly from Beccles. Sorry, Claire. So the last bit contains the instructions for what should happen after penance has been made. I won't read it out, but basically this form has to be returned back to the court. And if I just, this is written on the back of the schedule, and I'll read it. Okay. We, whose names are underwritten, the minister and church warden of the town of Wilby, within mentioned, do hereby certify that Samuel Collett of the said town performed the penance within enjoined in the said parish church at the time of divine service there performed. Witness our hands, John Carter, rector of Wilby, Samuel Smith, junior church warden. Now, there is a consequence if penance isn't carried out, and we'll look at that in a bit, because people did try and avoid it. So the penance we've just looked at, the schedule was for fornication or adultery, and then later on in the document, it seems to, I think it said fornication, but fornication and adultery were seen as equal crimes, and it was similar punishment. So fornication was just when sex happened with unmarried people. Adultery implies that one of them was married. So the penance for adultery or fornication was to say that statement in front of the whole congregation, so a big public humiliation. But there is a lot of evidence that fornication before marriage was a much lesser crime. And you may have noticed that the printed form, this one, is slightly different. Looking at the top part, the crime is described as fornication before matrimony, and the punishment is different. So this is going to the next bit. It's carried out in front of just the minister and the church wardens, and could take place in the chancel before service. So it's a much lesser humiliation. It's more secret. The reason why fornication before marriage is a lesser crime is before Hardwicke's Marriage Act of 1754, there was some ambiguity as when a couple were married. Was it at the betrothal or after a marriage ceremony in church? And we find in these documents, sometimes the accused will say, we intended to have banns read, or another excuse for why the marriage hadn't actually gone through. So that was one reason why it was a lesser crime. And the other thing, if you see it from the point of view of the church, one of the big motives for this was maintenance of children. And so in the previous schedule, the words said, it was, this is a lesson to us all. Take heart from my humiliation, don't follow my example. And it was the church didn't want to be landed with the maintenance of illegitimate children. So if a couple were married, then in those days, the husband would help look after them, pay for the child. So there's a lot more evidence about how getting married helped avoid a bigger punishment. So it's just not the wording of the schedules. There's other evidence within the documents that imply this. And this is I wrote a blog entry about this, so apologies if you read that. But this letter was found inserted in the volume, which was found in the box of penances, and it was obviously handed to the court by the accused. So here's a transcript of the letter. And at the bottom is an annotation which implies how the court worked, really. So the author is a clergyman, I think Henry Topping, born in Northamptonshire in 1698, and he became the vicar of West Bradnam in 1764, having become rector at Cockley-Cly in 1736. So Cockley-Cly and Bradnam, which is where the letter was written from, are together, and Scarning, which is mentioned at the bottom, the accused is from Scarning, are all together. And we'll find out as well that the woman concerned as well is from nearby. So it all makes sense that it was the vicar who advised the accused to follow this course of action. And so he's obviously the driver behind the process. So it's sort of self-explanatory, really. I like the quote about he's a good boy most of the time, but in an instance too common amongst young people. He's fornicating.
John, am I right in assuming that neither he nor the woman are in any circumstance, meaning she is not pregnant?
Wait. That's what I assumed, that she wasn't pregnant. But so if I click next, this is the entry in the corresponding entry in the book. It confirms that James Lacey was able to commute or convert into money payment his penance. So he paid a sum of money to avoid the public shaming. And the main part of the entry states, appeared personally the said Samuel Lacey and confessed antenuptial fornication by him committed with the said Mary, whereupon the surrogate enjoined him a penance, etc., but afterwards commuted it at 1 guinea, all but office fees paid to Dr. Peck. So commutation was a very popular route for those who could afford it. The amount charged for people who wanted to commute varied a lot, and it appears to be set by protocol and ability to pay. So I've seen it at over £10, which was an awful lot of money in 1730s, but I've seen it as low as 6 shillings. And in that instance, the accused is described as being very poor, and it implies that 4 shillings were paid to the court. No, 6 shillings were paid to the court, and that left him 2 shillings so he could get home. So he was spared his bus fare to get home after the court. So it wasn't a regimented amount. And I don't go on to this later in the talk, but there is an entry for the man, and he's fined just over £1. And then there's, following that, there's an entry for the woman, and unsurprisingly, she's fined £3. So, but that's the biggest difference I've found. I have found it when it's the same, but I don't think I've ever found it when it's opposite, where the man pays more than the woman. Different times. So the parish register for Wendling, Mary's home parish, confirms the marriage took place on 14th of April 1760. And on the same day, Monday, the couple had their son, also James, baptized. So the reference to circumstance is reference to the fact that neither of them were married. So it meant that they could actually get married and it was a lesser crime. So the church forced them to get married effectively. That is not uncommon, and that is evidence throughout the documents. So this volume from which this commutation was taken is fascinating. It's become one of my favourite documents in the whole archive. There is an entry which refers to an office book of 1726, which predates this volume, and it calls it the office book. So we just think this volume, and I've got it out, so the people that are here in person can have a look at it. We think it was the office book. And I think, and my colleague Tom backs me up on this, we sort of agree that we think its purpose was to record the business of the day, with the purpose of recording fees paid. So every action in the court appears to have an associated charge. So this is one of the entries, and you can see, so the commutation amount was £4 4s, and £1 6 of that was office fees paid to Armos, and that left £2 18 received by Mr. Smith, the surrogate. So that went into the main funds of the church, and it was, as you'll see, how it was used in a minute. So this is, depending on how you open the volume, it's either at the back or at the front, but this is a list of people, and the names do match up with a lot of the entries in the volume, and you can see that they're being charged £2 6, sorry, 2 shillings 6pence, 2 and 6, for just the process of the court. So this is the court fee, and probably the tax. So this entry in the volume is another commutation. As you can see, this is a double page spread from the volume. There's several entries on each page. This is typical, and each entry is a completely different transaction. So the first of these is another commutation. Focusing in on that. It's a fuller entry, but essentially it gives the similar information. And I've highlighted the key information. These records, there is quite a lot of legalese. So with the volunteers, they've been learning how to just focus in on the keywords. So key bits of information. Apologies, it's Suffolk again. Here are some of the, so it's Thomas Bradley of Brandeston, Suffolk, adultery with Hannah Pyatt, his then servant. There's an awful lot of that. Servants. And Penance commuted for charity. So they were keen to say that the money paid went for good causes. Skip through. No, sorry. So I mentioned before, what happens if you don't do your penance? The canon stated, notorious offenders shall not be admitted to Holy Communion till they be reformed. This entry states, Augustine Tower had been found guilty of fornicating, but was excommunicated for not carrying out penance. And there's different levels of excommunication. It could be very significant. People, if you're excommunicated, people weren't allowed to speak or do business with you or converse with you in any way. The entry continues to state he was now seeking absolution which was granted, and he was told he must do penance, which he did, as indicated in the margin. Fornication and adultery are by far the most common crimes being punished, but there are others. The second entry on this page is interesting, and it relates to a naughty clergyman. Highlighted the key bits of text. Arthur Womack, rector of Hillington and Great Pouring Land, his living unbecoming the office and function in which he was placed in the church, playing at cards in inns and alehouses, drinking, using the name of God vainly and lightly, under pain of the law and contempt thereof. He was effectively threatened with suspension. Now, we'll just have a look at some of the other crimes found in the penances. Again, these are the key bits of text. It relates to John Edwards of Scotto. He behaved lewdly towards Mary, the wife of William Parker, also of Scotto, and I quote, by handling her secret parts. And he was able to commute his penance by paying money and so avoiding public shaming. So this is the only entry I've found relating to this crime. Again, highlight some of the text. 5 points for the first person to see what the crime is. So it relates to a Henry Barrett of St George's, Sudbury, and Martha Barrett, widow, and the crime was incest. And it took place many years ago. So Martha was his late uncle's wife, Henry's late uncle's wife. So at this time, it was considered incest if sex happened between people related through marriage. But as I say, that's the only case of incest that we found so far. So this document was from one of the files of penance schedules. There are many such documents and they're slightly different to the schedules. It is a form of retraction and was used in causes of defamation. And it's probably worth looking at it in a bit more detail because the penance, the punishment was slightly different. This is the top half of the document. The key bits of text. It's a form of retraction enjoined unto William Foker of Great Ryborough for a certain defamatory words by him uttered and spoken against William Gibbs by the said William Foker to be performed in parish church of Great Ryborough. And I find this interesting. Before the minister, church wardens William Gibbs with 6 of his friends. It's quite intimidating and quite embarrassing. And this is what William Foker had to say. I won't read it all, but he has to say, I did call William Gibbs of this town a whoring rogue. And then he goes on to apologise. In the office book, you find a few dismissals, which are quite interesting. In this entry, Henry Monument of St Augustine's, Norwich, admits he has been the subject of a fame spread that he had committed the crime, of fornication with Susan Rice of Horsham St Faith, but denied the fact. The word fame in this context means common talk or rumour. We don't use the word now, but that's what it meant. Because there was no other evidence, the cause was dismissed. However, and I quote, if a voluntary promoter should appear, i.e. someone with evidence that supports the rumour, the court respects the right to reopen the cause. So you weren't cleared completely. So as mentioned before, we're running a volunteer programme to catalogue each entry in the office book and each paper from the file. Once this has been done, we'll wrangle the data and get it into our online catalogue. As you can see, we're establishing what the transaction is doing, enjoyment of penance, retraction, etc. The crime, the date, names, places, etc. All volunteers are doing this remotely using the cloud. So we've digitized and they can have a look at the images. And once again, I'll say a big thank you to those volunteers. We don't have the resources at the Record Office to do this granular cataloguing. So this really opens up the records. By the time we've finished, I think we'll have about 1,300 names added to the catalogue, which is good. Just from one box. To finish with, I want to look at how cases were brought to the attention of the ecclesiastical court. Often, it's blindingly obvious because a woman is pregnant and she's not married. So that's one way. On a regular basis, each parish was visited by someone from the diocese whose job was to check on the health of that parish. We normally associate that with them checking the fabric of the church and church property, but it also included the spiritual health of the parishioners. So they would record the number of people taking communion, and sometimes they would record cases of moral impropriety. So we have got one schedule where there's 3 women all named, and I haven't gone to check, but I suspect that they were all promoted by or prompted by an ecclesiastical visitation. Some parishes appear more than others of a similar size, which suggests that some clergymen and church wardens were more zealous than others. One of the clergymen that's cropped up is Bloomfield. He's mentioned doing his day job within the court system rather than writing about the history of the county. These 2 cases are interesting, and they follow each other in the office book, so that they're below each other on the same page. The first relates to George Durbin, apprentice to Peter Brown of Hempnall, Tanner, guilty of fornication, as I like the text. Guilty of fornication with Elizabeth Peel, his father's servant, which happened 4 years ago. And the second entry relates to George's brother, John Durbin of Long Stratton, apprentice to Mr. Gooch of Long Stratton, surgeon. He was accused by Dorothy Fryer upon examination. So she was going through the court process within a separate cause, and she would have been examined at deposition. And she was examined on 13th of February, 1741, so a few months before this entry. She accused John Durbin of being the father of her child. So the second entry was out of the Durbins' control, but I think it probably prompted the other brother appearing in court. So I'm wondering if the father wanted to clear his son's names before their careers progressed. But once being caught, we might as well sort out the other one. So both cases were commuted. So I think, if I'm correct, then I think the system is being used for the own purpose of the people coming before the court. They were playing the system in a way, or using it for that, so they could voluntarily bring the case if it suited them. There's one more case which sort of backs that up, that I think it was used by people voluntarily for a particular reason. And I think this cause, I'm conscious of time, is the most interesting. I'm not going to read it all because it runs to 3 pages. It is an enjoyment of penance for fornication but the amount of detail in there is more of a deposition. So the woman being accused is Mary Wriggle, now Great Yarmouth, before that a servant at the 3 Tons, which was next to Norwich Market, is no longer there, and kept by Mr. Royal. It's worth saying that there's information within these documents that is nowhere else. And Mr. Royal is not picked up by any other documents that we've got as being the licensee or the owner of that pub. I think she's voluntarily given very detailed information in order to get maintenance money for a child. The case relates to her fornication with a Jonathan Thornton, and this is where it gets really interesting and why you can see the motive. He is described as being of St. Michael at Plea in Norwich and chaplain to the Justices of the Peace for Norfolk and for the county prison, which at that time was at Norwich Castle. He was an important man with connections. The entry goes into great detail about where and how many times they fornicated. It appears that in July 1734, Mary became pregnant. Soon after, she goes to Great Yarmouth and works at the 3 Cranes, which was on the quay. So this is later down the page. Following Shrove Tuesday in 1735, Mary returned to Norwich, big with child. Though there appears to be a husband, Mary states the child is Thornton's, and there doesn't seem to be any doubt within the entry that Thornton is the father. She arranges to meet Thornton. He receives her fondly, expressing much of his former love. However, upon being told he is the father of the unborn child, he fell into a great passion and swore Mary would not receive 1 farthing. However, later that evening they meet again, this time in the company of an apothecary, a witness. So at the bottom, you can just about see there's 20 guineas. That's the amount that she asks for. And there's a bit of toing and froing. He offers 10 guineas, but eventually he says, all right, then I'll give you 20 guineas on condition that Mary goes to London. So obviously to remove any evidence that he's fathered a child. So Mary signs an undertaking that Thornton was discharged of all demands and that she would keep the matter secret. However, I quite like Mary. Instead of London, she goes to a man's house in the castle ditches, which is right next to where Thornton works at the castle. And there she gives birth to a boy. After a year, she could not subsist any longer in maintaining it without some further supply from Mr. Thornton. I'm not going to go through it because there's 1.5 pages of negotiation, and they both use justices of the peace, and there's quite a lengthy toing and froing. He refuses to give any more money, though he does suggest if she sends the child to him, he would maintain it, but would not give a farthing towards it whilst the child remained with Mary. So I think Mary brought this case to the church courts in order to embarrass Thornton into paying more maintenance. Quoting directly, wherefore that he may be discovered and his unfaithful treatment towards her, she was led to make this her confession. This was the only way that she could get recompense, get maintenance from him. But Mary was told to carry out penance, and it was later commuted. You can see this entry here. But in almost every case, the person being accused asks for it to be commuted, and it's done within the court case. This time, it's not done by Mary. Mary doesn't ask for the case to be commuted. Someone comes to the court and offers to commute it. So I suspect it was Thornton's man that came to avoid the public shaming. So the patriarchy in full working order. And the story ends sadly, unfortunately. It appears Mary's son, who remains unnamed through the whole document, he dies at the age of 4. So as this was coming to a conclusion. And it's rare to get such an insight into this sort of transaction of maintenance. So that's sort of, I'm coming to an end, that's the penances. But this is the next document from the Consistory Court Archive, and it's a file of exhibited documents, so produced as evidence and submitted to the court. As you can see, it's quite poor. It's a file again, and we can't really do anything with it until we conserve it. We can't start cataloguing it. So as you can see, hopefully that these records are just a treasure trove of places and names and events. So, unlike the penances, this has got parchment in it as well as paper, which adds to the complexity. So it would be remiss of me not to ask to say that we are opening a public appeal to raise money. It's going to cost £3,000 to conserve it, not catalogue it, just to conserve it. So this is the side, and you can see how torn and frayed and fragile it is. So put some links in there to where you can donate. But I hope you agree that the whole archive is just fascinating, and we're lucky to have it. And I've been here 20 odd years. Tom's been here even longer. We've known about this archive, and we've had other things to do, but there's hundreds of thousands of names in it, and we're just trying to open it up as much as possible so people can use it. And the fractured nature of it is it's very difficult to follow one case through the whole archive, because they're just bundled together in different files. So it's very difficult to know exactly the outcome of everything. But we have to do one box at a time. And as we do it, we pick up the names, and then people can start following the names through. Any donations people are able to make, gratefully received. So once it's conserved, we'll catalogue it, and it'll be available for people to use freely